What's up, movie fanatics? Today, we're diving deep into Peter Jackson's epic remake of King Kong from 2005. This wasn't just another monster movie. This was 3 hours and 21 minutes of pure cinematic insanity that took 4 years to make and cost a staggering $207 million. But here's the thing, behind those incredible visual effects and Andy Serkis's groundbreaking motion capture performance lie some absolutely bizarre production secrets that even hardcore fans have never heard about. We're talking about actors who almost died, a prop that weighed more than a real car, and a digital gorilla that required more computing power than the entire Apollo space program. Buckle up, because we're counting down 20 weird facts that are going to blow your mind. Let's get into it. Number 20. The Skull Island Wall was a real full-scale build. The ancient wall was actually built in New Zealand. You know that massive wall separating Skull Island's native village from the jungle where Kong lives? That wasn't CGI. Peter Jackson and his team actually built the entire thing full scale in a quarry outside Wellington, New Zealand. We're talking about a wall that stood 60 feet tall and stretched over 500 feet across. But here's the kicker. It wasn't made from lightweight movie materials. The production team used real stone, genuine timber, and thousands of hand-carved details to make it look authentically ancient. The construction took 8 months and required over 200 craftsmen working around the clock. They aged everything using blowtorches, chemicals, and even imported moss from different regions to give it that weathered, centuries-old appearance.
Deal. We agreed to push Maureen's start date so she could get a place so strange.
The wall was so massive that local aviation authorities had to be notified because it was visible from flight paths. And get this, after filming wrapped, Jackson wanted to keep it as a tourist attraction, but the New Zealand government made him tear it down because it was technically an unauthorized structure. The demolition took almost as long as the construction. That's dedication to practical effects that you just don't see anymore in modern blockbusters.
जरूर देखिएगा, क्योंकि आज की इस वीडियो में हम आपको इस फिल्म के बिहाइंड द सीन, शूटिंग और VFX ब्रेकडाउन.
Number 19. Andy Serkis studied gorillas for 9 months. Andy Serkis didn't just show up and put on a motion capture suit. This guy spent 9 months studying real gorillas at the London Zoo before filming even began. But we're not talking about casual observation. Serkis would arrive at the zoo when it opened and stay until closing, watching every movement, every gesture, every subtle expression. He focused particularly on a silverback named Kumbuka, studying how gorillas communicate through eye contact, how they move their shoulders when they're agitated, and how they show affection. The zookeepers actually gave him special access to restricted areas where he could observe gorilla behavior that the public never sees.
The point person for King Kong.
It was when Pete first asked me to do it, I was kind of...
Here's where it gets really interesting. Serkis discovered that gorillas don't just beat their chests when they're angry, they do it to release tension, and sometimes even as a form of play. This completely changed how he approached Kong's character. He incorporated these subtle behaviors into his performance, giving Kong a depth and emotional range that went way beyond typical monster movies. The zoo staff were so impressed with his dedication that they made him an honorary zookeeper. And speaking of dedication, Serkis continued visiting the zoo every weekend during the entire shoot to keep his gorilla mindset sharp. Number 18. Naomi Watts actually broke her wrist during filming. The injury happened during a chase scene. Naomi Watts was doing her own stunts for most of the movie, and during one particularly intense scene where Ann Darrow is running from the V-Rex dinosaurs, she actually broke her wrist. But here's the crazy part. She didn't realize it was broken at the time. Watts felt a sharp pain during the take, but thought it was just a bad sprain. Being the professional she is, she wrapped it up and kept filming for another 6 hours. It wasn't until she got home that night and couldn't move her hand that she went to the hospital. The X-rays showed a hairline fracture.
Fanning, who is Raymond.
Yeah,
Ramona to
yeah,
Raymond,
yeah.
and you're kind of like struggling with that as...
Now, most productions would shut down for a few days to let the star recover. Not this one. Peter Jackson rescheduled the shooting sequence so Watts could keep working, filming scenes where her injured hand wouldn't be visible. For action sequences, they brought in her stunt double for the wide shots and had Watts do the close-ups with her wrist heavily strapped under her costume. The production schedule was so tight that they couldn't afford any delays. Watts later admitted in interviews that the injury actually helped her performance in the later scenes because the pain made her fear feel more genuine. She wasn't acting terrified. She was actually in pain and genuinely scared of making the injury worse. Number 17. The Empire State Building climax was shot entirely on a soundstage. They built a partial Empire State Building in Wellington. When you watch Kong climbing the Empire State Building in the final act, you're actually watching him climb a partial recreation built inside a massive soundstage in Wellington. The production team constructed the top 15 floors of the building at full scale, complete with working windows, authentic Art Deco details, and even the original limestone texture. But here's what's truly insane. They built it on a giant gimbal system that could tilt up to 30 degrees in any direction. This allowed them to simulate Kong climbing while Andy Serkis performed on a more manageable angled surface. The set weighed over 80 tons and required a specially reinforced foundation in the soundstage. Moving on, the production designers flew to New York and took thousands of reference photos of the actual Empire State Building, then sourced materials that matched the 1930s construction. They even replicated the specific type of rivets used in the original building. The attention to detail was so extreme that architecture historians who visited the set couldn't tell it apart from the real thing. And get this, the lighting setup for the climax required over 400 individual lights to simulate dawn breaking over New York City. The electricity consumption was so high that the studio had to install additional power lines just for this set. Number 16. Kong's roar was created from lion, gorilla, and tiger sounds. The sound design took over a year. Kong's iconic roar wasn't just recorded from one source. Sound designer Mike Hopkins spent over a year creating the perfect roar by layering sounds from lions, tigers, gorillas, and even elephants. But the real secret ingredient? A sea lion. Hopkins recorded a sea lion at the Wellington Zoo that had a particularly deep, resonant bark. When pitched down and mixed with the big cat roars, it gave Kong's voice that distinctive emotional quality that made him sound both terrifying and somehow sympathetic. Here's where it gets technical. They recorded over 300 hours of animal sounds, then used cutting-edge audio software to blend them in ways that didn't exist in nature. The team even recorded Hopkins himself growling and grunting, then digitally processed his voice and mixed it in at very low levels. This added a subtle human quality to Kong's vocalizations that made audiences subconsciously connect with him on an emotional level. And speaking of emotion, different roars were created for different emotional states. Kong's angry roar had more tiger, his sad roar had more gorilla, and his triumphant roar had more lion. The sound files were so large that they required a dedicated computer just to store and process them during mixing. Number 15. The V-Rex dinosaurs weighed more in CGI than real T-Rexes. Digital weight had to obey real physics. The V-Rex dinosaurs that fought Kong weren't just random movie monsters. Weta Digital's team, led by visual effects supervisor Joe Letteri, actually calculated the realistic weight, muscle mass, and skeletal structure of these creatures based on real paleontology. Here's the mind-blowing part. Each V-Rex was digitally designed to weigh approximately 8 tons, which is actually heavier than a real Tyrannosaurus Rex. Why? Because they needed to account for Skull Island's ecosystem supporting larger predators. But wait, it gets better. The animators had to program realistic weight distribution into every movement. When a V-Rex ran, the computer calculated ground impact, muscle flex, and weight shift based on actual biomechanics.
To just animate what I call an eye of God point of view, which is just simply
This meant rendering times for V-Rex scenes were insane, sometimes taking 72 hours to render a single shot. The level of detail was so extreme that veterinarians who reviewed the footage pointed out accurate muscle movements that most audience members would never consciously notice. Moving on, each V-Rex had individually designed scale patterns, with over 50,000 scales per creature. No two V-Rexes looked identical. The lead V-Rex that fights Kong had a broken tooth and a scar above its left eye, details that most viewers never even register but that added to the realism subconsciously. Number 14. Jack Black was Peter Jackson's choice for Carl Denham. The director wrote the role specifically for him. Peter Jackson didn't audition anyone else for the role of filmmaker Carl Denham. He wrote the part specifically for Jack Black after watching him in High Fidelity and thinking he was the only actor who could balance charm, ambition, and moral ambiguity. But here's the weird thing. Jack Black wasn't sure he wanted to do it. At the time, Black was known primarily for comedy, and he worried that a dramatic role in a big-budget adventure film might hurt his comedic credibility. Jackson actually flew to Los Angeles and spent an entire day convincing Black that this role could show his range as a dramatic actor. The turning point came when Jackson showed Black test footage of Kong.
But we are exactly 33 weeks away from the release of the movie on December 14th.
And explained his vision for making Denham a morally complex character rather than a straightforward villain. Black was hooked. Now here's something most people don't know. Black insisted on using authentic 1930s film equipment in scenes where Denham is shooting footage. The production team sourced actual cameras from that era, and Black learned how to operate them properly. In several scenes, he's genuinely filming on antique equipment that's worth tens of thousands of dollars. The commitment paid off. Black's performance earned critical acclaim and showed Hollywood he could handle serious dramatic material, paving the way for his later dramatic roles.
Vaudeville wants that is a tough audience. If you don't kill them fast, they kill you.
Mr. Denham.
Number 13. The insect pit scene was cut from the theatrical release. The most expensive deleted scene in film history. There's a scene that Peter Jackson fought to include but was ultimately cut from the theatrical release. The insect pit scene, where crew members fall into a ravine filled with giant prehistoric insects, cost over $10 million to create and took months to film. We're talking about giant crickets, enormous centipedes, and flesh-eating slugs that were rendered in painstaking detail. The scene was so disturbing that test audiences reported feeling physically ill. Some people walked out during previews. Universal Studios executives got nervous and pressured Jackson to cut it. But here's the thing. Jackson didn't want to cut it because the scene served an important narrative purpose, showing the true horror of Skull Island and raising the stakes. The final cut version was 8 minutes long and featured some of the most gruesome creature effects ever put on film. When Jackson eventually released the extended edition on DVD, he included the full scene, and it's genuinely nightmare-inducing. Fun fact, the giant insects were based on prehistoric species that actually existed. The design team worked with entomologists to create scientifically plausible giant versions of ancient arthropods. And speaking of plausible, each insect had fully animated internal organs that would be visible when they were injured, even though most of that detail never made it to the final cut. Number 12. Kong's eyes required their own rendering department. The eyes took 18 months to perfect. Peter Jackson was obsessed with getting Kong's eyes right because he knew that's where audiences would connect emotionally with the character. Weta Digital assigned an entire team of 15 animators to work exclusively on Kong's eyes for 18 months. Here's why this was so complicated. Gorilla eyes aren't like human eyes. They have different reflective properties, different iris structures, and different ways of expressing emotion. The team studied countless hours of gorilla footage, measuring pupil dilation, tracking eye moisture levels, and analyzing how light interacts with gorilla eyes in different conditions.
एक ऐसी फिल्म जो अपने mind-blowing VFX, realistic CGI और dangerous action.
But wait, it gets more technical. They developed new software specifically for rendering subsurface scattering in Kong's eyes, which is how light penetrates and diffuses through the eye tissue. This gave Kong's eyes that lifelike quality where you can see depth and moisture. The level of detail was insane. Kong's eyes had individual blood vessels in the whites, realistic tear ducts, and even the subtle yellowing that occurs in aging primates. In the scene where Kong and Ann watch the sunset on Skull Island, you can actually see the sunset reflected accurately in Kong's pupils. That one shot took 3 weeks to render. The I-Team joked that they spent more time on Kong's eyes than most movies spend on entire characters. Number 11. The entire movie was shot in New Zealand, including New York. Wellington became 1930s Manhattan. Not a single frame of King Kong was filmed in New York City, despite half the movie being set there. Peter Jackson recreated 1930s Manhattan entirely in Wellington, New Zealand. The production built functional streets, complete with working storefronts, vintage cars, and hundreds of background actors in period clothing. But here's what's really impressive. They didn't just build facades, these were functional buildings with interiors, working plumbing, and electrical systems. The attention to period accuracy was obsessive. The art department sourced authentic 1930s vehicles, brought in vintage experts to ensure every detail was correct, and even researched the specific advertisements that would have been visible in 1933. Moving on, for the wider shots of New York, Weta Digital created the most detailed digital city ever rendered at that time. They modeled over 5,000 individual buildings, each with unique architectural details. The digital New York was so accurate that urban planning historians used it as a reference for what Manhattan actually looked like in the 30s. And get this, the digital model included the interiors of buildings visible through windows, street-level details like fire hydrants and mailboxes, and even the specific types of trees that would have been planted in that era. All this for shots where most viewers wouldn't notice the details. That's Peter Jackson's perfectionism for you. Number 10. Peter Jackson almost made this movie in 1996. Here's something that'll blow your mind. Peter Jackson was actually set to direct King Kong back in 1996, right after The Frighteners. Universal Pictures had greenlit the project with a budget of $150 million, and Jackson had already started pre-production work. Scripts were written, concept art was completed, and the special effects team was assembled. But then, something happened that changed everything. A little movie called Godzilla was bombing at the box office in 1998, and Universal got cold feet about giant monster movies. They pulled the plug just weeks before filming was supposed to begin. Jackson was devastated. He'd dreamed of making King Kong since he was a kid, but here's the twist. The cancellation turned out to be a blessing in disguise. If Jackson had made Kong in the 90s, he wouldn't have had the motion capture technology, the digital effects capabilities, or frankly the clout that he gained from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. When Universal came back to him in 2003 asking if he still wanted to make King Kong, Jackson had just won 11 Academy Awards for Return of the King. Suddenly, he had an unlimited budget, complete creative control, and access to the best technology in the world. The 9-year delay made King Kong infinitely better than it would have been in the 90s. Number 9. Andy Serkis performed Kong while wearing a gorilla suit. You might think motion capture is just about wearing those little dots and sensors, but Andy Serkis took it way further. For many scenes, he performed in a full gorilla suit that weighed 45 pounds and was covered in motion capture markers. The suit had extensions on the arms to match Kong's proportions, which meant Serkis was essentially performing on all fours with weights attached to his limbs. Try doing that for 12-hour shooting days. But here's why this was necessary. Peter Jackson wanted Kong's movements to have real weight and gravity. By making Serkis work against actual resistance, his performance had authentic strain and effort that pure imagination couldn't replicate. The suit was so realistic that when Serkis walked around the set between takes, crew members would do double takes thinking an actual gorilla had gotten loose.
Master doesn't like you. Master doesn't get you. Does care. Master is using you.
There were some scenes where...
And speaking of the suit, it was custom built by Weta Workshop and cost over $70,000 to create. They made 3 versions, one for dry scenes, one that could get wet, and one lightweight version for the most physically demanding sequences. The suit had to be repaired or replaced multiple times during the shoot because the intense physical performance literally tore it apart. Serkis later said wearing that suit was the most physically challenging work he's ever done, and he did Gollum.
Keep it don't be too shy.
Number 8. Naomi Watts had to learn silent film acting techniques. Naomi Watts didn't just show up and act normally. Peter Jackson insisted that her performance as Anne Darrow reflected the acting style of 1930s movie stars, particularly Fay Wray from the original King Kong. So Watts spent months studying silent films and early talkies, learning techniques that modern actors never use. She worked with a movement coach who specialized in period performance, learning how women carried themselves differently in the 30s, how they gestured, and how they expressed emotion with more theatrical physicality. Here's the really interesting part. In scenes where Anne performs for Kong, Watts is literally doing vaudeville routines that she learned from actual 1930s performance manuals. The juggling, the pratfalls, the exaggerated facial expressions, these weren't improvised. They were authentic entertainment techniques from that era. Jackson even brought in a vaudeville historian to ensure accuracy. And get this, for the scenes where Anne screams, Watts studied Fay Wray's specific scream technique, which involved a certain way of opening the mouth and projecting that created that iconic 1930s movie scream sound. Modern actresses scream differently. Watts had to unlearn her natural instincts and scream like someone from 80 years ago. The dedication paid off. Her performance feels genuinely transported from another era. Number 7. The Brontosaurus stampede took over a year to animate. The scene where the crew runs through a stampede of Brontosaurus-like creatures, that single sequence took over a year to complete and became one of the most technically complex scenes ever animated at that time. Weta Digital had to create artificial intelligence for each dinosaur so they would react realistically to obstacles, other dinosaurs, and the humans running through them. We're talking about programming thousands of individual decision points for creatures that don't exist, but here's what makes it insane. They couldn't just copy and paste dinosaurs. Each creature needed unique running patterns, unique reactions, and unique physical characteristics. The team created 47 different base models, then varied them with different sizes, colors, and movement styles. The herd ended up containing over 300 individual dinosaurs, each with its own AI brain. Moving on, the physics calculations were overwhelming. When dinosaurs collided with each other or trampled environment objects, the computer had to calculate realistic weight, momentum, and impact. A single frame of the stampede could take 18 hours to render. The entire sequence required over 250 terabytes of data. To put that in perspective, that's more data than the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy combined. And the kicker? The scene is only 2 minutes long in the final film. Number 6. Adrian Brody did his own stunts and almost drowned. Adrian Brody, playing playwright Jack Driscoll, insisted on doing almost all his own stunts despite the production having professional stunt doubles ready. But one particular scene nearly killed him. There's a sequence where Jack is underwater, trapped beneath logs while trying to escape from creatures. Brody was actually underwater for that scene, holding his breath while cameras rolled. The plan was for him to hold his breath for 30 seconds, do the take, then surface. Simple, right? Wrong. During one take, Brody's costume got genuinely snagged on one of the submerged props. He couldn't surface. He started panicking, thrashing underwater while the crew initially thought he was just acting. It took safety divers 15 seconds to realize something was actually wrong and get him free. Brody surfaced, coughing and disoriented. Most actors would have called it quits and let the stunt double take over. Not Brody. After a 20-minute break, he went back underwater and completed the scene himself. Here's the crazy part. The take where he nearly drowned is actually in the movie. You can see genuine fear in his eyes because he was actually scared. Peter Jackson later admitted they should have used the stunt double, but praised Brody's commitment to authenticity. Number 5. Kong's fur was the most expensive digital effect. Kong's fur wasn't just painted on digitally, every single hair was individually rendered and animated. We're talking about 9 million individual hairs that each moved independently based on wind, movement, and environmental factors. The software required to create this didn't exist when the movie started, so Weta Digital had to invent it from scratch. The first system, called Barbershop, took 3 years to develop and cost over $15 million, more than the entire budget of most independent films. But here's why it was necessary. Peter Jackson insisted that audiences needed to see Kong as a real living creature, and nothing breaks immersion faster than fake-looking fur. So every hair had to cast shadows, catch light realistically, get wet when it rained, and even show individual strands moving when Kong breathed.
Here's your story, boys. Beauty and the man who saved her from the beast.
The rendering time was astronomical. Some close-up shots of Kong's face took over 120 hours to render a single frame. That means 1 second of footage, 24 frames, could take 3,000 hours of computer time. And speaking of computers, Weta Digital had to build a dedicated render farm just for Kong's fur. At its peak, they were using over 4,000 computer processors running 24/7. The electricity bill for rendering Kong's fur alone exceeded $2 million. That's insane dedication to realism. Number 4. The movie almost bankrupted Universal Studios. The official budget for King Kong was $207 million, making it one of the most expensive films ever made at that time. But here's what most people don't know. The actual cost was much higher. Industry insiders estimate the true production cost, including marketing, was closer to $350 million. Universal Studios bet everything on this movie. If it had flopped, the studio would have faced serious financial consequences. Executives were sweating bullets during production because costs kept escalating. Peter Jackson had such complete creative control from his Lord of the Rings success that Universal couldn't rein him in. Sets that were supposed to cost $2 million ended up costing $5 million. Effects shots that were budgeted at $50,000 ended up costing $200,000. The movie went over schedule by 3 months. But here's the thing. Jackson knew what he was doing. He was creating something that couldn't be compromised by budget concerns. Universal executives visited the set, saw the footage, and realized they had to let him finish his vision or risk releasing an incomplete mess. The movie ended up grossing $550 million worldwide, making it profitable but not the massive blockbuster Universal hoped for. It would take years for the studio to fully recoup its investment through home video sales and television rights.
Here's your story, boys. Beauty and the man who saved her from the beast.
Number 3. Kong's death scene was shot 27 times. The final scene where Kong dies on top of the Empire State Building is emotionally devastating, but getting it right was torture. Peter Jackson shot Kong's death 27 different times over the course of 6 weeks. We're not talking about different camera angles of the same performance. These were completely different performances taken by Andy Serkis, each with different emotional approaches. Some versions had Kong dying angry, some had him dying peacefully, some had him trying to fight until the very end. Jackson couldn't decide which felt most authentic and emotionally true to the character. Here's where it gets really interesting. After shooting all 27 versions, Jackson went into the editing room and started cutting them together. He realized that the most powerful version combined elements from multiple takes. So the final death scene you see in the movie is actually a digital composite of 5 different performance takes blended seamlessly together. Serkis's eyes came from take 14, his breathing came from take 9, his final hand movement came from take 23, and his facial expression came from take 7. The blending was so seamless that even Andy Serkis couldn't tell when watching the final cut. This Frankenstein approach to performance became standard practice in modern motion capture filmmaking. And speaking of emotion, grown men on the crew cried during the final cut screening. That's when Jackson knew he'd gotten it right. Number 2, the original cut was 4 hours and 30 minutes long. Peter Jackson's first cut of King Kong was 4 hours and 30 minutes long. That's not a joke. The man filmed so much material and became so attached to every scene that his initial edit was essentially 2 full movies. Universal executives watched the 4.5-hour version and had a collective panic attack. There was no way they could release a movie that long. It would mean fewer showings per day, which means less money. Theater owners would revolt. So began the painful process of cutting. Jackson spent 9 months in the editing room trying to get the movie down to a releasable length. He tried a 4-hour cut, still too long. A 3.5-hour cut, still too long. Finally, he got it down to 3 hours and 21 minutes, which was still longer than Universal wanted. But Jackson refused to cut anymore. Here's what got removed. An entire subplot about a stowaway on the ship was completely deleted. There was a longer version of the insect pit scene that was even more gruesome.
Hey, Wellington, thank you so much.
There were extended character moments between Anne and Kong that showed their relationship developing more gradually. The theatrical cut feels rushed in places because Jackson had to accelerate the pacing. The extended edition released on DVD restored 30 minutes of footage, but even that isn't everything. There's still over an hour of completed, fully effects-finished footage that's never been publicly released. Jackson has said that footage will eventually be released, but as of now, it remains locked in the vault. Number 1. Andy Serkis only appears on screen for 3 minutes. Here's the number 1 weird fact that'll blow your mind. Andy Serkis, who gave the performance of a lifetime as Kong and spent 18 months on the production, only appears as a visible human character for approximately 3 minutes of screen time. He plays Lumpy, the ship's cook, in a handful of brief scenes. Most audiences have no idea they're looking at the same actor who played Kong. But here's why this is actually brilliant. Peter Jackson cast Serkis as Lumpy specifically so audiences would see his human performance and subconsciously connect it to Kong's emotional expressions. It's a metatextual trick. When you see Lumpy's facial expressions, you're seeing the same face that created Kong's emotions. This creates a subliminal link in the viewer's mind. Moving on, Serkis's work on King Kong revolutionized motion capture performance. Before this movie, motion capture actors were considered technical operators, not real actors. Studios didn't credit them properly, and they certainly weren't considered for awards. Serkis changed that. His Kong performance was so powerful that it sparked a legitimate debate about whether motion capture performances should be eligible for Academy Awards. The Academy said no at the time, but the conversation had started. Today, motion capture actors are respected performers, and it's entirely because of what Serkis did with Kong. He proved that the technology doesn't create the performance, the actor does. That's a legacy that extends far beyond this one movie. And there you have it, 20 weird facts about King Kong 2005 that even hardcore fans probably didn't know. From a 45-pound gorilla suit to 9 million individual animated hairs, from a movie that almost bankrupted Universal Studios to a 4.5-hour first cut, Peter Jackson's epic was a production nightmare that somehow resulted in a masterpiece. We've covered everything from broken bones to revolutionary motion capture technology, from deleted insect horrors to the most expensive digital fur in film history. This wasn't just a remake. It was a complete reinvention that pushed filmmaking technology to its absolute limit and proved that practical effects combined with cutting-edge CGI could create something truly special. Which fact shocked you the most? Did you know about Andy Serkis nearly destroying his body in that weighted suit? Or that Kong's death scene was actually 5 different performances digitally merged? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into movie magic, smash that like button and subscribe for more behind-the-scenes secrets from Hollywood's biggest blockbusters. Hit the notification bell because we've got more incredible film stories coming. Until next time, keep watching movies and remember, sometimes the craziest stories happen behind the camera, not in front of it.